même si vous trouvez des bons acheteurs ou des distributeurs en Europe, il faut s'assurer que vous avez une bonne stratégie pour acheminer vos produits de l'autre côté de l'Atlantique. Alors aujourd'hui, cette session, nous avons Christian Sivière. Juste vous dire en passant que vos questions sont importantes pour nous. Alors, vous pouvez nous les acheminer en utilisant l'adresse courriel qui est indiquée à la droite de votre écran principal. Et nous allons voir si on a un peu de temps là, pour peut-être répondre à ces questions-là. Et pour les présentations, nous les enverrons à la fin, à la suite de l'événement pour s'assurer que vous avez tout ça. Donc, Christian, merci de vous joindre à nous aujourd'hui. À savoir pour nos auditeurs que Christian, tu as 30 ans d'expérience en tant que transitaire international en Europe, au Canada. Vous donnez des cours à plusieurs établissements dans la région de Montréal et vous travaillez de très proche avec l'Association des transitaires internationaux canadiens, le groupe Export alimentaire Québec-Canada, ainsi de suite. Et vous êtes surtout président et fondateur du groupe Solimpex qui conseille aux compagnies. Donc, je vous donne la parole, Christian, pour que vous puissiez nous parler un peu plus de tous ces aspects reliés à la logistique. À vous.
Merci, Christophe. Thank you very much, Christophe. And thank you to the Trade Commissioner Office for the invitation to speak to you today on this great three-day seminar on the CETA agreement and how to maximize its benefits for Canadian companies. So we're going to talk, I want to tell you before I begin that we're going to talk about shipping products to the EU, but we're going to talk a little bit about also about the wider topic of shipping and logistics. And we'll talk about some of the issues that are tied, that fit into with logistics and how to get your products, what are the main ingredients to get your products to the EU safely and economically. So we'll talk about more than logistics. And so on my first slide, what I wanted to show you was as the date that the agreement was put into place. If we can move to the next slide, please. And that is just to clarify, just to confirm, to make sure everyone understands that the CETA agreement is in full effect as far as trading of goods, as far as buying, as far as selling, as far as customs tariffs and duties are concerned. It's in full effect since September 21st, 2017. I think it's good to remind us of that because sometimes we know that the agreement has the term provisional implementation attached to it. So sometimes it can create confusion for some. And so I found it was important to clarify this first. And so ever since September 21st, 2017, our products are more competitive in the European Union because of the elimination of customs duties and tariffs, with the exceptions of the products where the duty elimination was phased in over several years. Now, on the next slide, I want to clarify some of the terms, some of these acronyms that we come across. Now, it's possible that some of you have not heard of an entity called the European Free Trade Association. So I just want to clarify, Europe is far away and we're not all excellent in geography, so we can't necessarily know all these things all by heart, but there's an entity in Europe called the European Free Trade Association, and so not the European Union. These four countries are not part of the European Union. However, we have a free trade agreement with them since 2009. So that was the first thing I wanted to clarify. On the next slide, I wanted to show you briefly, illustrate what the European Union is, how many countries it has, who are the members. So we have 27 members. Here they are. So that is all pretty clear. On the next slide, I want to show you, clarify, come across sometimes. Next slide, please. Yes, that is the Eurozone. So for us in Canada, sometimes it's a bit confusing. We'll hear about the European Free Trade Association, which we just explained what it was a moment ago, but sometimes we'll hear about the Eurozone. and we'll hear about the European Union. So it's a bit confusing at times. And so I just wanted to show you, to tell you that if we go back to the previous slide, please. We went too fast here. Previous slide is about the Eurozone. So what I wanted to clarify for you is that the Eurozone is a group of 19 countries that are part of the European Union and that have the same currency. So that's what the Eurozone is. It's EU countries that use the same currency. Now, how is that important for us, or what is the impact for us? Well, the impact is that it's good for us to know that these countries have this same currency, the euro, because in some cases, we'll talk about it in a moment, if we sell direct, sometimes we can conduct transactions in euro currency, and because it'll be easier for our clients. And I also wanted to say in this context that it's possible to have a euro-denominated bank account in Canada. So just like, when we do a lot of business with the US, sometimes we'll have a US dollar bank account. And if we do a lot of business with the European Union in euros, it could be interesting to have a euro bank account. And we can do that right here in Canada. Next slide is on the next slide, I want to show you the main benefit of the European Union as a trading bloc is that it's referred to as a customs union. So what that means is that there are no borders for goods within these 27 countries. And so as a result, if you're a Canadian exporter and you sell your goods in the EU, in any of these countries, once your goods arrive at the European port of entry or the European airport of entry, they go through customs. They go through customs once, and then they enjoy free movement within these 27 countries. So that's a very important feature. It's different, for example, it's very different from the NAFTA context or the CUSMA context, where we have borders for goods between Canada and the US, and between the US and Mexico. Within the EU, there are no borders for goods. So goods are enjoy free movement as soon as they're clear customs, and you only need to clear customs once. And it doesn't matter where you clear customs. You can clear customs at the port of Antwerp or Rotterdam or Helsinki or Valencia. It doesn't matter. Your goods, once they go through customs, they enjoy free movement in all these countries. So that was to clarify the advantage of the European Union customs union. Next slide, please. I want to share with you a couple of technical details which I think are important to know about. I'm starting from the point of view of the fact that maybe many of you are exporting to the US and have been exported successfully to the US for some time, but you're not exporting outside of the US. And now you're interested to expand, diversify your markets, and you're looking at the European Union market, which is excellent. And you want to use the benefits of the CETA Free Trade Agreement. So one of the things that we need to learn, we need to become familiar with when we start expanding and diversifying outside of the US for our export markets, we need to become familiar with some of the terms of reference. And so there's important contractual terms that are called the Incoterms that we really have to become familiar with when we deal with the European Union, when we deal outside of North America. And so that's the first thing I wanted to point out to you. If you're only exporting to the US, you don't really need to know the Incoterms. You should as a rule, but you don't have to, because in the US, they often use other terms of references like FOB origin or FOB destination. So these are not international Incoterms. These are US terms that come from the Uniform Commercial Code. And so we need to go beyond that and become familiar with the international Incoterms if we want to successfully develop business outside of North America, in particular in the European Union. Next slide will show you, I wanted to show you a couple of Incoterms, 3 Incoterms, just for those of you who are not familiar with the Incoterms, just to illustrate some of the ones that could be good to use and to know about. So there's 11 Incoterms, and out of these 11 Incoterms, I want to tell you more specifically about 3 of them. The first one, FCA, refers to the fact that um, your customer will come and pick up the goods. Your customer will make the shipping arrangements and will bear all the costs and have all the responsibilities of shipping the product, which happens sometimes. And so there, the Incoterm would be FCA. If your customers, or if you decide to ship the goods to your customers in the EU and pay for the shipping cost to make it easy for your clients, or also for competitive reasons, then one of the best Incoterms to use in a case like this is CIP. And then the last one refers to the fact that sometimes it can be advantageous, and also for strategic reasons, you may want to sell direct to European customers, to European end users, and there you could use the DDP Incoterm, and that would be a way to make things very easy for your European customers. And so I want to zero into this DDP Incoterm on the next slide. And so that is my summary of the Incoterms that I wanted to share with you. So let's make ourselves familiar with international Incoterms, and because we cannot use our usual terms of reference that we use with the US. Now, I really enjoyed the presentation from Zach and Martin on the rules of origin. I think this was extremely good. This was very, very interesting, useful. And I'll touch on rules of origin briefly. I'm not going to repeat the whole presentation, obviously, but just touch on a few points and to highlight also the importance of rules of origin. The rules of origin really are the crux of a free trade agreement, because they are the rules that tell us if our product qualifies or not, and that depends on its, for the most part, I guess, on its foreign content. How much foreign content does it have, and can it qualify? And so I really want to stress again the importance of rules of origin. I'll tell you, a few years ago, there was a survey that came out from KPMG that was highlighting the fact that many companies don't fully utilize free trade agreements. And in fact, the percentage that they were referring to was 80%. 80% of the companies surveyed don't fully utilize free trade agreements. And the main reason for that was that they found the rules of origin too complicated and too hard to follow. And so I think this is a lesson we can learn from that. And it helps us highlighting the fact that rules of origin are extremely important. And if we want to export goods, unless we export agricultural products, natural products. Of course, if you're growing cranberries in BC and exporting them to the EU, or if you're harvesting wild blueberries in Nova Scotia, you don't need to worry about rules of origin. Rules of origin are important, are the crux of a free trade agreement for manufactured products. And so what I wanted to share with you, what I wanted to insist on, is the fact that rules of origin are very important. Don't take it lightly. Don't assume that your products qualify. But don't be afraid of them either. I think the key here is to take the time to be well informed, to inform ourselves of what they are, how they're structured, understand them. Knowing where to find them is the first step, but understanding what they really mean and how to interpret them, how to decipher them is another. It can be challenging sometimes. So I would say what I wanted to say on this issue is don't hesitate, spend the time, invest the time that's necessary to understand them so that you know if your products qualify or not. If you need assistance, get outside resources, get some specialists, some experts to help you with that. Don't take the subject lightly, and don't be afraid of them either. So the first page I wanted to show you on this slide is to illustrate the fact that you see it refers to chapter chapters, headings, subheadings, that refers to the customs tariff code. So you have to invest a minimum amount of time to learn about that in order to be able to decipher and understand the rules of origin. On the next slide, I'll show you an actual rule of origin from the CETA Free Trade Agreement. So Zach and Martin explained that to us very well. The two main components are the change in HS code, of tariff code of a product, as well as the percentage of regional value content. So two things I wanted to say about this. When we talk about the regional value content in a free trade agreement, it does not just refer to the percentage of Canadian products. So you have to realize that in the context of a free trade agreement, the regional value content refers to Canadian and European content in a product, not just the Canadian content. For example, let's take as an example a typical Canadian product, a Ski-Doo, made and assembled in Canada. It's made and assembled in Canada mainly from Canadian components, but it also has foreign parts, foreign components. And it so happens to have motors that are made in Austria and tracks that are made in Finland. And so if you're a manufacturer of this Ski-Doo, if you're manufacturing this Ski-Doo, to arrive at your percentage of regional value content, you add the Canadian content and the Austrian content and the content from Finland to arrive at the global regional value content. And so some companies sometimes don't realize that. They think that it's only the Canadian content that qualifies. But the contents from the other countries, part of the free trade agreement, also qualify. And so we add them all up. So that's the first element I wanted to share with you, to clarify with you. The other thing I want to say is that all these free trade agreements all look the same. They all have very similar structure as far as the rules of origin. They all look like this, and they have numbers. They are organized numerically by HS code. They talk about chapters, headings, subheadings, regional value content. They all look the same, but don't assume that they are the same. If your product qualifies for NAFTA or CUSMA, don't assume that it qualifies for CETA, because even though the rules of origin look very similar, they are very different in the details. So that's the other thing I wanted to share with you. And the last point on that, on rules of origin, is something we have to take very seriously, because on the next slide, I wanted to show you what the origin certification looks like. And it's interesting because Martin talked about it, because there was a question in the previous session about that. And so the origin certification that the exporter has to provide as part of the commercial documentation, usually as part of the commercial invoice, it's actually very easy, very simple. For the CETA agreement, it's much shorter than for NAFTA, for example. It's just 2 or 3 lines, a couple of sentences that you have to put on your commercial invoice, or that can be on any document. And most people prefer to put it on their commercial invoice. That's the most practical way of doing it. And what I wanted to say is, don't be fooled by the fact that it looks easy. It's not something that you can fill out lightly. The origin certification is something that binds the company, that has legal implications. If customs find out that your goods don't qualify, then you would be getting penalties, and you would get them retroactive. So it's something, even though it looks easy, it's something not to take lightly. And so we have to do a thorough research to make sure that our products qualify before we sign such an origin certification. On the next slide, I wanted to show you very briefly the type of documentation that we need to supply when we ship our goods to the EU. It's nothing extraordinary. It's the basic standard export documentation is required. Your commercial invoice, your packing list, your commercial invoice, as we said a moment ago, will have your origin certification on it. So nothing extraordinary there. And we touched on it on the previous session. If you have food products or plant products, then you may have to supply a health certificate, phyto certificate, etc., etc. So that really depends on the product, but nothing extraordinary as far as documentation is concerned. On the next slide, I want to show you the another important aspect of exporting to the EU, and that is indirectly tied to shipping. It's the fact that for some products, there are some standards that we have to follow, and so the main one, the one that's the most commonly used, or that's the best known perhaps, is the CE standard. It applies to a number of products. Uh, as highlighted on the screen. And so this is, of course, part of the whole process of exporting, because if your products are not certified according to the appropriate standard, then customs will not allow it into the EU. So it will be part of the process that customers will check. And so the CE standard is not the only one. On the we'll show you a couple of examples of other standards that may apply to your goods, depending on the product that you're shipping. Next slide, please. So you have the REACH standard, the EUP, the ROHS. And so the beauty of the CETA agreement is on the next slide, please, where I want to show you that the very important chapter 4 of the CETA agreement, where we have the protocol on mutual recognition of standards, standard assessments. And so the beauty of the agreement is that if you're a Canadian company and you're exporting to the EU and your products are subject to CE standards or one of the other standards that we just illustrated, you don't have to send your products to the EU to get them tested and certified. You have organizations in Canada that are certified, that are accredited to test and certify your products according to EU standards. Where would you find that information? Then you'd simply look it up on the Standards Council of Canada website, as is highlighted on the slide here. They have this is where you'll find you'll just type in the standard that you're interested in. Here on this screenshot, I think we took the ROHS standard, but you do the same search for CE and whatnot. And then so that will give you a list of Canadian companies that are accredited to test and certify your products according to EU standard. A great benefit of the CETA agreement, particularly for SMEs, because it's faster and cheaper to get our products accredited. If you were on the EU side, the corresponding organization is the European Accreditation Office. Next slide, please. Briefly here, I want to talk about export strategies. These are the classic export strategies. When you attack a new market, you'll be trying perhaps to sell direct, or you'll be selling through an importer or distributor. You may have an agent, you may have a joint venture, or a licensing agreement with someone who will produce locally. Really, what I want to share with you on this is two things. First of all, tell you that we have to be aware of the fact that in the European Union, there are laws that protect distributors and agents, and they are a little bit more tricky, let's say, than Canadian laws. So we have to be aware of that. So before you enter into a distributor agreement or an agency agreement with a company in the EU, do your homework and do the appropriate research, particularly about the legal aspects and implications, so that you're protected, so that if one day you need, for some reason, you need to change agent or change distributor, it's not as easy to do that as it is in Canada, especially if we have not anticipated it from the beginning. So the second element I wanted to talk to you about, market entry strategy, actually is on the next slide, selling direct. So on this slide, what I want to show you is the fact that it's very practical, very convenient, and quite easy for a Canadian company to sell direct in the European Union, to sell direct to end users, industrial customers, and whatnot, the same way we do in the US. as you probably know, most of our exports to the US are done on a DDP basis, or there we call it FOB destination. And as a result, the Canadian exporter becomes the importer of record in the US, becomes a non-resident importer. Well, you know, this is very practical. It's a very nice, very practical way to enter a new market. It almost puts you on an equal footing with local companies. But guess what? It's possible to do that in the EU. You can sell on a delivered duty paid basis in the EU and sell directly to European customers. You can sell directly to a Decathlon in France, or Continent in Germany, or El Campo in Spain. You don't need to have a local presence there. You don't need to have a subsidiary or a branch office. What you do need, though, in order to do things properly, particularly on the VAT, is you need to have a fiscal representative. And so what a fiscal representative enables you to do is to maintain a stock in the EU, have a distribution center in the EU. Next slide, please. This could be your stock in the EU, in a distribution center somewhere in the EU. Of course, it doesn't have to be your distribution center. It will be subcontracted, especially at the beginning. Maybe all you want to do is to rent one of these pallets there, or one of these, the space of one rack, a very small space, but it would be your stock, and it would be there waiting for orders and waiting for distribution to EU customers. And so you can do that in the EU, selling DDP, be the importer of record, be a non-resident importer, have your stock in a distribution center. Next slide will highlight the fact that the distribution center can deliver for you within a day or two to all across Europe. You can bill your European customers in local currency in cases like this, because that's probably going to be easier for them. So you can bill them in euros, and these operations, you can still account for these transactions in Canada. Doing this does not give you a nexus in the European Union, does not give you fiscal obligations for corporate taxes and this and that. You can still account for these in Canada. So it's a very easy, very powerful way to start. After you're well established, when your volume grows, then maybe you want to establish a presence. But to begin, you don't need to have any of your own presence. And that's a very practical way of entering, and very powerful way of entering the EU market. It is very easy to set up, to manage, as long as it's set up properly at the beginning, of course. And so one of the challenges about that in the European Union that I will show you after the next slide. The next slide, please, will show us where would be the best the ideal spots to locate a distribution center in the EU. There's been several studies done on that, and everyone sort of agrees that the best area is the north of France, the south of Germany, Belgium, Netherlands, Luxembourg. These are the areas that are closest to the center of Europe, that are closest to the major ports, and that have all the infrastructure, the roads and railways and canals, and also workforce to be able to deal with European distribution. So next slide is what Canadian companies sometimes are hesitant about, is the VAT. So I wanted to share this with you very briefly without spending too much time on it. The VAT is a complicated issue. But it is how it is. It is part of the European Union. It is also complicated for Europeans, not just for outsiders. If you're a Danish company and you have clients in Greece, or if you're a Portuguese company and you have suppliers in Poland, you have to deal with the VAT. You need a fiscal representative. So the key for us here is, let's equip ourselves. Let's team up with a fiscal representative. He or she will help us establish ourselves, sell DDP in the EU, and start dealing with local customers as if we were a local company, without having made an expensive long-term commitment into an actual presence there. So it's very easy, very powerful to do that in the European Union. Next slide, please, I want to show you very briefly what a customs entry looks like in the European Union. And why I wanted to show that to you is also to develop something that Martin or Zach talked about. A while ago, we talked about HS codes and the fact that sometimes it's difficult to find out your HS code. So indeed, you have the info tariff, Canadian tariff finder. But of course, that's only the Canadian tariff number. So the European HS code number is the key to customs conformity there. And that's what's going to be shown on the EU customs document. So one way to be covered on that, if you're not sure about your HS code, is to ask for the equivalent of a ruling. In Canada, we call it a ruling, whereby we apply to CBSA to have them confirm the HS code that applies to our product. You can do the same in the European Union. As Martin mentioned, it's called the BTI, for Binding Tariff Information, and it's accessible and easy to do. So that would be the thing to do if you're not certain about your HS code for conformity reasons. Next slide. I want to show you a couple of technical points or operational points that are important to know when we want to deal with the European Union, particularly if we are exporting on a DDP basis. Let's become a little bit familiar with the TARIC. We'll have it in a moment. The European Union, as we mentioned a while ago, is a customs union. So there's one customs code. It was revamped in May 2016. And so we have to become a little bit familiar with it. The EORI that I illustrated on the slide is the equivalent, is the EU equivalent of an importer number in Canada. And it is possible for a Canadian company to have an EORI number. And so if you sell DDP, as I was explaining a moment ago, you'll have to have an EORI number, and your fiscal representative can apply for you and to obtain that number. And once you have a number assigned in any of the 27 countries, then you will use it in all the other countries. The AOE refers to, or AEO, sorry, refers to security of the supply chain. Those of you who are familiar with PIP in Canada or CTPAT in the US, it's the European equivalent. And again, it's possible for a Canadian company to be assigned to get an EOR, an AEO number. On the next slide, I want to show you the EU, the portal to search for customs information on the EU side. It's called the TARIC. It's a very powerful tool. And this is where you would validate your HS code, and you would also validate the measures that apply to your products. I would say it would be the second step after having looked up the HS code, the tariff code in the Canadian Tariff Finder. The second step is to validate it in the TARIC. On the next slide, I'll show you what the TARIC looks like. So you see, it will confirm to you the HS code, the duty rate or the tariff, as well as a link to the measures that are applicable to the product. On the next slide, I want to show you very briefly, talk to you very briefly about intellectual property. As you know, when we export, we want to protect our brand, we want to protect our image, our name, we want to be sure we're not going to be copied. It's very practical to do that in the EU because there's one office that handles that. So one filing with the UIPO will protect you in all 27 countries. And that takes us to the next slide, where we want to talk more about shipping more precisely. First, I want to share some thoughts about shipping goods by air cargo. Of course, the majority of our products are sent by boat, by ocean freight, because it's cheaper. But there are a lot of products that are exported by air, and that's either because they're perishable or they're high value or they're urgent or seasonal. So here, of course, there are challenges. There are pandemic-related challenges. We all know that there's less flights available. We all know that we're not flying very much. We don't really have the possibility of flying very much. There's far fewer flights than there used to be. That's passenger flights. And so the impact it has it has a great impact on our ability to send cargo by air, to ship air cargo, because usually in normal times, about half of the cargo that's shipped worldwide is shipped on passenger flights, as is highlighted on that slide where you see the cabin where we are all sitting comfortably, sipping on our coffee. And below us is our baggage and our cargo, or the freight that has been shipped. So imagine half of cargo being shipped worldwide is shipped on passenger flights. And on the next slide, you will see that the other type of aircraft that we have that carries cargo worldwide around the world is cargo flights, planes that only handle cargo. And so you can imagine the impact this has on prices when cargo flights that usually carry 50% of cargo currently carry about 95% of cargo because there are no passenger flights or hardly any passenger flights. And that's why it has been harder since the pandemic. It has been harder to ship goods by air and more expensive. On the next slide, I wanted to show you a very nice initiative that is helping a lot. This is an Air Canada Airbus A330 passenger flight that has been temporarily converted to carry cargo. So what they have done, and many airlines around the world have done that, and Air Canada has been one of the pioneers on that, they remove the seats and in order to carry, and they fly between different cities around the world to carry only freight, only cargo. So this is a great help because of the fact that there's very few passenger flights flying. So this is helping. And Air Canada today is deriving quite a bit of revenue from cargo, far more than from passengers, and far more than usual times. On the next slide, I want to show you how easy it is and how convenient and how predictable and reliable it is to send goods to the European Union by ocean freight. Our main port of exit to ship ocean cargo into Europe is the port of Montreal. It's kind of almost dedicated to Europe. You can also ship from Halifax. Halifax also has services. The port of Vancouver also has very reliable services. From Vancouver, then it's a bit longer because we go all the way down to the Panama Canal before we cross the Atlantic. So from Vancouver or BC or Alberta, sometimes we will rail goods to Montreal and then they'll sail across the Atlantic to Europe from Montreal. It will be a bit faster. So the essence here is that there's multiple shipping solutions. There's several sailings a week, up to 3 sailings a week from Montreal to the north of Europe. On the next slide, I'll show you that there's also separate dedicated services going to the south of Europe, going to Spain, Italy, south of France. And so that's also on a weekly basis. It takes a week to 10 days. So very reliable, multiple services available. And that is really helping us to our ability to export competitively. On the next slide, the last thought I want to share with you before we open the floor for questions is to tell you that because of these multiple services that are available from the Port of Vancouver, Montreal, and Halifax, and the fact that there are several carriers operating, so it's a competitive world, and there are big ships. Ships are getting bigger and bigger. So as a result, unit costs are reasonable, are kind of, the thought I wanted to share with you is that, to ship a container load of products from Saskatchewan to Europe, or from Ontario or Alberta, or Quebec or whatever, it's actually way cheaper than to send a trailer load to California, to Texas, or to Mexico. So don't think that shipping costs are an issue. When you want to explore new markets, particularly the European market. It's actually the opposite. Shipping costs are very competitive, and we have a lot of different shipping services available, and so it's actually an advantage. So don't see shipping costs as a hindrance. It's actually an advantage. And so this will end the presentation, the material that I had prepared for you today. And I look forward to exchanging with you, and I hope it's been interesting, informative, and I thank you very much for your time and attention. And I look forward to questions from Christophe.
Thank you so much, Christian, for this overview. Quite efficient. So it's almost like a checklist, right, of all the things you need to take care of if you want to make sure your products land in the possession of your customers. Here's a question here about how can or who can help us finding the best option in terms of carriers.
As far as shipping is concerned, I mean, particularly for ocean lines, but also for air carriers, there's so many companies that offer these services, but sometimes it's hard to tell and they are hard to approach because they're big and they're centralized. And particularly if you're a small exporter, if you're an SME and you're starting, my advice there would be to look for a reliable freight forwarder, an international freight forwarder, and so will help you navigate and negotiate through these carriers, and it would be very helpful, particularly when we begin, and particularly for SMEs. And so you can look up, for example, on the website of the Canadian International Freight Forwarders Association, CIFFA. They'll have not only the list of forwarders, but they will also have by province and by city, but they also have valuable information about logistics and exporting and rules and regulations.
That's excellent. Well, you mentioned about starting up, and I know that there are some big companies out there with, who represent a big client, right? And so if I'm a smaller company and I'm starting, is there a minimum of volume involved before I call onto a professional that can help me?
I don't think so. I think the key there really is to connect with the right people. I mean, in the world of freight forwarding, of logistics companies. I mean, let's face it. There are some huge companies. There are some very big companies out there, and those very large companies will be perhaps set up to serve large customers. Indeed, this is how they operate. But there's a lot of smaller companies, smaller independent, even including Canadian-owned small companies that are quite efficient and that will be able to help, even if you have small business, because don't forget we all start small. I mean, we have to begin somewhere. So I think the key here is to connect with the right type of organization, the right type of logistics specialist. And I would tend to think that the smaller ones, the local ones, will be easier to access and will listen to you more than the big ones. The big ones, they all want big business. They all want to deal with Procter and Gamble and with GE and that. It's still there's no minimum quantity, minimum volume. A small, well-equipped, and a small professional freight forwarder will respond to the smallest of customers because they know that a small customer today will get big tomorrow.
Well, that's a good message for our auditors, right? Do not be intimidated by the whole process. There's resources out there. We have just a few minutes left, so I'm going to read my question very quickly.
Yes.
We have a question here from Ela Botos from Genemis Laboratories Incorporated. So here's the question. If you have an EORI number and do not have a legal or fiscal representative in a European market, can you still import the goods into the European country?
Yes, you probably can. Yes, I think. However, if you have a fiscal representative, that will the reason to have a fiscal representative, or the main function, is to help you navigate and manage things like the VAT. And so you can still be an importer in the EU if you have the EORI number. But you won't be able to, for example, get the VAT back. Whereas if you're set up with a fiscal representative, you should be able to claim some VAT back. And so it is possible, but it's not optimum.
Perfect. Now, Christian, you're in the business here, so you mentioned some costs associated to shipping those products. There's been a lot of movements lately with COVID. How do you expect how our shipping costs will evolve over. What do you see as an expert in the field?
Well, I would say it's a tough question, but I'm hoping that the air freight costs have really gone through the roof because for two reasons: lack of flights, and also um, we had personal protection equipment at the beginning of the pandemic, and then now we're going to have vaccines that will take precedence and that will take the space, whatever space is available. Um, and that's why it's tricky. That's why air cargo rates might remain relatively high. So what we have to hope for is that passenger flights will come back, and that will start, coming out of lockdowns as far as international travel is concerned. And so the more flights there are, then the more passenger flights there are, then the more option that will be to ship cargo, and I think it will help us bring prices down. So, hoping that passenger flights come back steadily and gradually, then it should bring air cargo rates down. And on ocean freight, I think it's going to be more an issue of regulatory issues. I think on ocean freight, the rates have really gone up because of an artificial reduction in supply. Carriers has started having what they call blank sailings, kind of limiting the space available in order to maintain the rates at a certain level. And actually, rates went up when China started to come out of lockdown, when the US and Canada started to replenish stocks for the year-end trade. So ocean rates have almost doubled from Asia to North America and from Asia to Europe. Our export rates from here haven't increased that much, but they have increased a bit still. So I think I would count on the fact that perhaps governments will intervene a little bit to try to manage this a little bit and to maintain a certain rates at a certain level, because I think it was almost like going to profiteering almost, like ocean rates have gone up in a matter of a few months. They've doubled, and so there was no justification for that. So I think they'll come down.
Okay, well, thanks so much, and for all our entrepreneurs out there, more self-learning and research, but at least you have your plan ahead of you, thanks to you, Christian. Christian, thank you so much for sharing with us your expertise.
My pleasure.
We look forward to your questions. Participants, don't be shy.